Part 2 then, everybody. I'm just reading this. Acts 21:10, 11, Agabus scene 2, a prophecy with 2 small mistakes. Following just after the verse mentioning Philip's daughters, 2 more verses describe another prophetic event which confronts Paul. Still in Caesarea, Luke writes, "While we were staying for some days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, and coming to us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his own feet and hands, and said, Thus says the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owns this girdle and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." Acts 21:10, 11. There appear to be 2 competing factors in this passage. On the one hand, Agabus's introductory phrase, "Thus says the Holy Spirit," suggests an attempt to speak like the Old Testament prophets who said, "Thus says the Lord." On the other hand, however, the events of the narrative itself do not coincide with the kind of accuracy that the Old Testament requires for those who speak God's words. In fact, by Old Testament standards, Agabus would have been condemned as a false prophet because in Acts 21:27-35, neither of his predictions are fulfilled. First, Agabus predicted that the Jews at Jerusalem would bind Paul, Acts 21:11. The Greek word for bind here is dio. However, when Paul is actually captured in Jerusalem, later in the same chapter, Luke tells us twice that it was not the Jews, but the Romans who bound Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Acts 21:33. Similarly, in reflecting on this event, the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he was bound. That he had bound him. Acts 22:29. The second mistake in Agabus's prophecy concerns the second detail he predicted, the fact that the Jews would deliver Paul into the hands of the Gentiles. Here the Greek word for deliver is paradidiome, to deliver, hand over. Essential to the sense of this word is the idea of actively, consciously, willingly, delivering, giving over, handing over something or someone to someone or something else. This is the case in all of the other 119 instances of its use in the New Testament. This word, paradidomai, is used, for example, of Judas delivering Jesus into the hands of the Jewish leaders. Matthew 10:4, 26:16, etc. Of the Jews then delivering Jesus into the hands of the Gentiles, Romans. Matt 20:19, delivering John the Baptist to prison. Mark 1:14, Moses delivering laws to the people. Acts 6:14, or Paul delivering teachings to the church, 1 Corinthians 15:3. None of the other 119 instances of the word in the New Testament lacks the idea of an action that is consciously intentionally done by the one doing the delivering. But in Luke's narrative following the prophecy of Agabus, he shows that the Jews do not deliver Paul over to the hands of the Gentiles rather than intentionally giving Paul over to the hands of the Gentiles, as the Jews had done with Jesus. For example, they tried to kill him themselves, which is in Acts 21:31. He had to be forcibly rescued from the Jews by the Roman tribune and his soldiers, Acts 21:32-33, and even then he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, Acts 21:35. Now it might be argued that Luke has no intention of showing that Agabus gave an inaccurate prophecy. These are really only differences in detail. Someone might say, however, this explanation does not take full enough account of the fact that these are the only two details Agabus mentions. They are, in terms of content, the heart of this prophecy. In fact, these details are what make it unusual as a prediction. Probably anyone who knew how the Jews thought out the empire, had treated Paul in various cities, could have predicted, with no revelation from the Holy Spirit at all, that Paul would meet violent opposition from the Jews in Jerusalem. What was unique about Agabus's prophecy was this prediction of binding and delivering into the hands of the Gentiles. And on these two key elements, he is just a bit wrong. Now, it is especially in the case of prophetic pronouncements that accuracy in detail was an essential mark of authenticity. Note the following examples. So Joshua 6:26, Joshua predicted that the man who rebuilds Jericho, at the cost of his firstborn, shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. In 1 Kings 16:34, both predictions come true for Hiel of Bethel. 1 Kings 13:2, a man from Judea predicted that someone named Josiah would be born to the house of David and would sacrifice the disobedient priests themselves upon the altar at Bethel. In 2 Kings 23:15-16 and 20, this prediction comes true. 1 Kings 17:14, Elijah predicted that the jar of metal would not be used up and the jug of oil would not run dry. In 17:16, this prediction comes true. 1 Kings 21:23, Elijah predicted that the dogs would eat Jezebel within the bounds of Jezreel. In 2 Kings 9:35-36, this prediction came true. 2 Kings 7:1, in famine-stricken, besieged Samaria, Elisha predicted that one day later, about the same time of day, a measure of fine meal would be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. In 2 Kings 7:16, this prediction comes true. More examples could be given, but the pattern should be clear regarding the mistakes in details in Agabus's prophecy. Dr. D.A. Carson writes, I can think of no reported Old Testament prophet whose prophecies are so wrong on the details. Furthermore, Luke is aware of the legitimacy of making prophetic fulfillment explicit where it occurs. Luke 4:21, Jesus claimed that Isaiah 61 1-2 had been fulfilled in himself, which is in Luke 24:44. Acts 1 16-20, Peter claims that the predictions about Judas in Psalm 69:25 and 109:8 were fulfilled. Acts 3:18, the predictions of all the prophets that the Messiah should suffer were fulfilled. Acts 11:28, the prediction of Agabus that there would be a famine over all the world was fulfilled in the days of Claudius. Acts 13:27-29, the Old Testament prophets' predictions were fulfilled when the Jewish leaders condemned Christ and had him crucified. Acts 13:33-35, the Old Testament predictions of Christ's resurrection were fulfilled. Acts 2:25-31. But in the case of this prediction by Agabus, even in contrast to the general prediction in Acts 11:28, Luke's silence about the fulfillment is telling. Not only do we have an unfulfilled prophecy, but a prophecy whose two elements, binding and giving over by the Jews, are explicitly falsified by the subsequent narrative. Two other considerations support this interpretation. First, the nature of the error itself. It is not that Agabus has spoken in a totally false or misleading way, it is just that he has the details wrong. But this kind of minor inaccuracy is exactly compatible with the type of prophecy we found earlier in 1 Corinthians, in which the prophet receives some kind of revelation and then reports it in his own words. He would have the general idea correct. Paul would be imprisoned at Jerusalem, but the details somewhat wrong. In this case, for instance, the text could be perfectly well explained by supposing that Agabus had a vision of Paul as a prisoner of the Romans in Jerusalem, surrounded by an angry mob of Jews. His own interpretation of such a vision or intuitive insight from the Holy Spirit would be that the Jews had bound Paul and handed him over to the Romans, and that is what he would erroneously prophesy. Secondly, such a solution makes the Agabus narrative fit Luke's larger purpose in this section, which is no doubt to show the contrast between Paul's sure knowledge of God's will and his resolute purpose to obey it in spite of personal danger, Acts 20:22-24, 21:13, and the uncertain grasp of God's will possessed by the prophets and other disciples whom Paul meets, Acts 21:4 and 12-14, and who try to dissuade him from going to Jerusalem. The close connection with the misleading instructions in Acts 21:4 is especially significant. Both the prophecies in Tyre and the one in Caesarea are nearly right, but not completely so. It seems therefore that the best solution is to say that Agabus had a revelation from the Holy Spirit concerning what would happen to Paul in Jerusalem, and gave him a prophecy which included his own interpretation of this revelation, and therefore some mistakes in the exact details. Luke then recorded Agabus's prophecy exactly, and recorded the subsequent events exactly, even including those aspects of the events which showed Agabus to be slightly wrong at some points. The remaining difficulty with this interpretation of the text, however, is the introductory phrase Agabus uses, "Thus says the Holy Spirit." There are three solutions that might be proposed for this. Agabus claimed a divine authority of actual words for his prophecy, and the minor discrepancies are not sufficient to nullify that claim, for he was generally correct. In this case, Agabus will be seen as an example of a prophet who is different from the prophets in 1 Corinthians. He will be more like the first type of prophet, such as John in Revelation, who claims an absolute divine authority. My own problem, this is Wayne Grudam, my own problem with this view is that I find it hard to reconcile with the Old Testament pattern of precise fulfilment of prophecies. Strictly speaking, Agabus predicted 2 events which did not come to pass. Deuteronomy 18:22, and with the fact that Luke so clearly describes the non-fulfilment of the 2 parts of the prophecy in the immediately subsequent narrative. I'll just read B. Mind you, B is pretty long. No, I think I've done. I've enjoyed reading a bit of that, and I've not done a video for ages, so I thought, why not record a bit and upload it onto Northern Hero channel, the Blessed channel. Goodbye for now, everyone.